Once you're ready to actually start customizing and tailoring the application to fit your specific customer needs or your business needs, one of the important things to do is to actually go out and do what's called kind of a gap analysis. And it's really to understand, what does Dynamics 365 have available from a functionality standpoint that's already built in that I can work with versus what does the customer or my organization specifically need me to work with in order to make that facilitate. Now, it's not as big a thing with Dynamics 365 and some of the new ways that they've worked through it, because with things like AppSource, and you're able to go out and download things like Field Service and Project Service Automation and Voice of the Customer, and many different things that allow you to tailor the application very specific to your type of business, whether that's financials, operations, some of those individual situations. But at the same point, there still might be functionality in there that doesn't meet the needs from what it is that you're doing. And in those cases, this is where you would start creating entities and fields. So for example, maybe you were customizing Dynamics 365 for a bank and they need to go out and capture loan applications. Since Dynamics 365 doesn't really have that loan application entity out of the box, you would want to go in and create it and create the necessary fields to make that work. And so in this module, what we want to do is really look at how you customize the application. So we're going to talk a little bit about just the entities overview, what's available out of the box and what items are available from that standpoint. We're going to talk a little bit about entity ownership and how that's going to reflect how you may or may not customize the application. We're going to talk a lot about the different entity properties. So when you create an entity, whether you create a custom entity or work with a system entity, what are some of the different properties that you can define to control how it might interact with other elements of the application? Do you want to be able to store documents up in SharePoint for this entity? Do you want to be able to use OneNote to capture notes for this entity? These are some of the different things that we'll talk specifically about from an entity property standpoint. We'll talk a little bit about system versus custom entities. What's the difference between using something that originates out of the box and something that you have to create from scratch? We'll talk a little bit about just what are some of the different Dynamics 365 fields that are available, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the different field types, and set the stage for some of the more advanced type field topics that we'll talk a little bit about in some of the later modules. When you start working with entities, it's important to note the different types of entities that are available inside CRM. And there's really three that you're going to work with exponentially from a customization perspective. And that's going to be system entities, custom entities, and then activity entities. And let's first talk just a little bit about system entities. These are the things that ship out of the box with Dynamics 365. So these are the things like the account entity, the contact entity, cases, opportunities, business units, the things that you would see from a core functionality standpoint. A lot of these system entities do have functionality around them that you can modify. Like you can go in and enable some of them for Interactive Service Hub. You can go in and define whether or not you want to use document management and some of those capabilities. Some of them do have those capabilities to be modified. Some of them, depending upon what their core functionality is within the application, do not have a ton of customization or modification capabilities, but most of them do. The big thing to remember with the system entities is those system entities cannot be deleted. So the core functionality around contacts, accounts, those types of options, once those entities are in that system, you can't delete those or remove them from the system. The other thing is because those are the core baseline functionality that you would be looking at, you also can't do what's called lock them down through a managed solution. They will always be customizable. They will always have the capabilities for people to make changes to them, as opposed to certain types of custom entities where you can actually lock them down and prohibit people from making changes. And when we get into the entity definition, we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. Custom entities are when you've decided that it is now time to create something specific to my needs. And so those are typically going to be done by somebody who has system customizer capabilities. They might be a system admin, or they might just have the system customizer security role associated with them. Or you have a solution that you're importing in that contains those custom entities as well. Custom entities, once they've been created in the system, those have full modification capabilities. You can modify custom entities, you can delete custom entities. The only exception to this would be if you had them included in a managed solution, and that managed solution had them locked down through what's called the managed properties. And when we get into the properties here, we'll talk a little bit about what the managed properties is so you can see specifically how those items might be locked down. The other thing that you have are what are called activity entities. And so these are basically things like appointments, tasks, phone calls, things like that that you would be as oftentimes associating with records inside CRM. Most of the time, activity entities are just an attached option. There is no separate kind of security privileges for those options. There's basically, you either have the capabilities to use activities or not use activities for your specific use case. Now, the nice thing is the out-of-the-box activity entities are there and you can work with them as much as you need to. You also have the capabilities, if need be, to create what are called custom activity entities. And so these would be things maybe like timesheet entries or something like that, where you wouldn't necessarily want to use the standard out-of-the-box appointment entity, but you want to go ahead and create something that you can modify to create and capture timesheet information and then use some of that options as you're moving forward. When you create an entity, one of the first things you have to do is you have to define the entity ownership. Now, entity ownership has to be set for any entity within the application, and once it's set, you can't change it. What you're going to find is most entities use what are called user or team-owned ownership. And so that would be things like accounts, contacts, opportunities. Basically what you're saying when you define it as a user or team-owned entity is that there's going to be somebody or a group of people inside your organization that are going to be responsible for this record. And so what happens is it creates what's called an owner field, and it adds that owner field to some of the default views inside the application. So for example, if I have account and it's user owned or user or team owned, that basically means that myself, Derek, can be responsible for a specific account in the application, or there might be a specific team of people who might be responsible for that. What happens when you create a user or team owned entity is it also has different security role privileges associated with them. So if you were to go into the configuration course and look at some of the security role items, you would see that this is where you have the ability to set it to, at a business unit level, at a user level, at an organization level, and you can define who should be able to work with those items. You really see user or team owned for accountability or for security within the application, and it's really the more commonly used ownership record type as you're working through. The other option you have is what is called organization owned. And basically at that point you're saying that there is no physical one person or group of people that are responsible for this record or this group of records. Basically, these are owned by the organization. So there's no ownership field that's tied to it. There's really only, from a security standpoint, you either can work with that entity or you can't work with it. These are when people basically need to have access to all records within the organization or no access. A real good example of organization-owned entities would be things like the products and items in your products, business units, users. Users are not necessarily owned by a specific person. They might have a manager that you can define, but they're not necessarily owned by one person, they're owned by the organization. So one of the key things you always have to keep in mind when you're working through it is who's going to own this as part of the application itself. Each entity will have what are called entity properties. And these entity properties are used to control exactly what you can do with this entity inside the application. Before we delve into kind of all the ins and outs of those, let's talk about some of the key aspects that you're going to see from an entity standpoint. So when an entity is first created, one of the first things you're going to see is the display name. So as you can see here, this is the account entity that actually has the display in the plural name. The display name is how do you want it displayed in the application? The plural name would be anytime you're using multiple versions of this entity, how do you want it to be displayed? So for example, if you were in the My Active Accounts view, this would be defining how you would see the word accounts displayed. This is completely customizable. So even for out-of-the-box entities, if you don't call your accounts accounts, if you call them customers or you call them organizations or something like that, this is where you could go in and change the display name and the plural name in the application. The schema name or the name field is actually how it's going to be defined in the database itself. And once the schema name has been set, you can't change it. So this would be for custom entities that you would be creating. This is where that publisher prefix would be predefined within that situation. So this is where you can see that because this is an out-of-the-box entity, the schema name is really basically just called account. Then you have additional things like, what color do you want to use for the entity? Do you want to have an image associated with it? So for example, since this is accounts, would I like to have the ability to go in and see like a company logo associated with each account? Or if this was a contact, would I want the ability to see their picture associated with it? That's what you see from kind of a primary image perspective. And then each entity has to have a primary field that's associated with it. The primary field basically is like the name of the field. It's not necessarily the GUID or the ID of the record. That's a separate thing that gets defined automatically behind the scenes. This would be things like the name field. And typically the primary field has to be a text field within the application. That does have some additional properties that you can modify based upon those things, but it's really what is the main field that you want to use for this individual option. Then you get into what are called kind of your entity situations or your entity properties. And so these are some of the different properties that you can define for the organization itself. And so each entity has these items that can be turned on. So things like business process flows. Do you want this entity to take place in business process flows? Do you want to be able to capture feedback? One of the new features that was recently added to Dynamics 365 is the feedback entity, where you can associate feedback with specific records or items inside the application. So if you were creating something and you wanted people to be able to provide their thoughts or their items and use maybe like rating scales, you can associate that and create and allow feedback to be created. This would be also things like, do you want them to be able to use notes, activities, connections and connection rules? Is this an entity where I should be able to send emails to them? And if so, it'll create an email field for me. Do I want this to be able to use queues? And do I want to be able to associate this with queues in the application to assign ownership? These are some of the key things that you might see that are available for each one of these entities. Now you'll notice that many of these have kind of a little plus sign next to them. Basically, the difference with the items that have the little plus sign next to them is that once you enable this functionality, you can't disable it. So things like feedback, notes, activities, connections, once you turn that functionality on, you can't turn it off. You can basically elect not to use it, but you do have to have the functionality, turned on from that standpoint. But then there's also things like document management, access teams. Do you want to be able to use SharePoint to store document information associated with this entity inside a SharePoint scenario? Do you want to use access teams to be able to kind of share this record on the fly? And we'll talk more about access teams and access team templates as we move into some of the additional modules. Do you want to be able to use knowledge management? So one of the things that CRM has is a knowledge management capability where you can look for knowledge base articles directly from a record inside the application. This gives you the capabilities to determine whether or not you want to enable that functionality, or if you want to use service level agreements on this functionality. If you have any type of key performance indicators that you would want to use to define whether or not we're meeting the specific promises that we've made for a customer, you can enable an item for SLAs. Then you get into things like data services. Do you want to do duplicate detection? Do you want to allow quick create? Those types of options. Do you want to do change tracking, which is actually something that's more accessed through the developer platform than anything. But then you get into things like Outlook and mobile. Do you want to enable it for mobile? If you do want to enable it for mobile, do you want to enable mobile offline? Do you want them to be able to see it in Outlook? And if so, what are some of the options you want to be able to configure around these things? So these are just some of the specific entity properties that you can turn on and off kind of as needed when you're working through it. Now, each entity also has what are called managed properties, and we talked a little bit about this at the top of the module and then in the solutions module. But what the managed properties basically defines is if I were going to include this entity in a managed solution, how modifiable do I want it to be? And so not only does the entity have these managed properties, but even items like the individual forms and the fields and some of those things actually have individual things that can be modified from those standpoints. So for example, what you see here would be the entity properties for kind of a generic customized entity, basically saying that if I include this in a managed solution, what do I want them to be able to do? Should they be able to customize this entity? If I set this to false, they can't really do anything to it. If I set it to true, then I can go down into each specific item and define things like, can they change the display name? Can they go in and change additional properties? Can they turn on document management? Can they turn off document management? Can I create new forms? Can I create different views? Can I create different charts? These are all things that if you are going to include this and you want to lock it down a little bit, these are things that give you a lot of functionality to really safeguard your investment. Now, a couple things to remember is out-of-the-box components, things like account, contact, opportunity. All of those have their managed properties set to be customized, and that can't be changed. So when you create a custom entity, you can go in and modify and set the managed properties kind of however you want. But for out-of-the-box functionality, that's already basically been predefined, and you can't go in and change that. Another consideration that you want to look at is how these entities and these items are going to be interacted with on mobile platforms. And so one of the things that you see on the entity definition is what are called controls. And these controls are basically just field and data set visualizations that you can use to determine how things are going to be presented on the mobile application. Because you're working with a different form factor, sometimes it's not easy to go ahead and just kind of click in a text field and then type something. Sometimes if you had like a star button or something like that where you could just select the number of stars, or you had a switch or something that you could work with, this is where it would make it much easier to interact with that information on that mobile application device. And this is where, from an entity perspective, you can actually go in and work with controls. Now, the cool thing about controls is there's a bunch of predetermined ones out of the box that allow you that functionality, and you can determine how they're presented not only on the web application, but also on the mobile and the tablet applications. What's neat about the controls is part of Dynamics 365 is they've actually added a control called editable grids. So historically, when we've worked with CRM, we haven't necessarily had the capabilities to use editable grids. We could see the list, but we couldn't interact with it. We had to actually open the record up to be able to facilitate it. Now with this concept of editable grids, I can go in under the Controls tab and I can determine if I want to use editable grids for Dynamics 365, and I can determine if I want those editable grids to be at a web application level, a phone or a tablet level, or any combination of the three as I'm moving forward. And then this is where, based upon what that entity is, this is where I can define how people are going to interact with that editable grid. And so as part of the demonstration as well, we'll show you how to turn on and enable kind of editable grid functionality inside the application. We mentioned this a little bit at the top of the module as well, but you have to really spend some time thinking about when to use system entities versus custom entities. Again, the system entities were really designed to provide kind of a level of flexibility that would allow you to use them in multiple types of different implementation scenarios. So if need be, you can go in and you can change the display name or the plural name for any of the out-of-the-box entities as needed. In addition to that, each one of those out-of-the-box entities have messages that are associated with them that also should be customized to reflect that name change. But one of the things that you really want to do is, before you go in and decide, okay, I'm going to create a custom entity for loan application, or I'm going to create a custom entity for bank account, determine whether or not some of the existing entities in the application could be used. If you're not currently using them for your deployment, could I rebrand them or reuse them to meet a specific need? Sometimes you'll find that it works out beautifully and you could absolutely do that. Sometimes you'll find that maybe it doesn't necessarily fit what it is that you're trying to work with. For example, there are some entities that actually have system behavior. For example, marketing lists. A marketing list can only be associated with account, contacts, or leads. So if I was going to go ahead and create a custom entity called vendor, and I wanted to send marketing materials to vendor, I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. However, I could just use the account entity, add a custom field to that allows me to flag them as a vendor, and then add specific vendor information to that entity to allow me to capture that. So one of the things you always want to look at is, what's currently there and how would I tweak that to really fit my specific needs? Another consideration that you have to keep in mind when you're creating these custom entities is how people are going to access them. So security rules, in essence, is really what we're talking about here. So from an application perspective, a lot of times what I see when people are creating these custom entities is they're doing so as the system administrator. So they create the custom entity, they make all their customizations, and then they want to go out and they can test it. They hop into the entity, everything shows up fine, and they can work with it from there. The problem is system administrator security rules already has access to everything within the application. Once you create a custom entity, the application doesn't necessarily know who should have access to that. So it's very important for each security role that needs to have access to this entity that you go in and open up that security role and then go over to the Custom Entities tab. And when you go over to the Custom Entities tab, you will see that custom entity that you've created, and you will see a series of different privileges and access levels. You have to go in and define those privileges and access levels for each custom entity that you create. As I mentioned, system administrator will already have access and basically have organization access to all of those. Any other roles that you're working with will have to go in and be added the appropriate access in order for them to work. This is a very common oversight sometimes that people make. So just make sure that if people are saying they can't get into an entity, make sure that you've gone into the security roles for each of those users, given them access to the entity, and that usually solves the problem. The final consideration to think about with entities is at some point in time, you may encounter a situation where you don't necessarily have a need for an entity anymore. This is particularly, happens when you start talking about custom entities. There's a few things you need to remember about deleting entities inside the application. First and foremost, if it's an out-of-the-box system entity, so something like account, contact, those types of situations, those just flat out cannot be deleted because those are core functionality. Now, you can choose not to have them a part of navigation. You can choose to not have them exposed, through the sitemap and different things. That's absolutely something that you can do. But as far as physically deleting them, you don't necessarily have an option around that. Custom entities, if you've gone in and created them, they can absolutely be deleted. So if you define that you don't need this custom entity anymore, you can go in and remove it. A couple things you have to remember though is there cannot be any dependencies with other items on that situation. So for example, if I have a lookup field on another entity that is looking up my information to my custom entity, I cannot delete that custom entity because I have another item on that application that is using that particular entity. So you would have to remove dependencies. And when we get into talking about fields and forms and views, we'll talk a little bit about where those dependencies come into play so you can specifically see how that works. The other thing is if you have them as part of a managed solution. So if I had created that loan application entity and that was added as part of a managed solution, I can't go in and delete that directly. The only way that I can delete that or remove that is I have to go in and remove the solution. And once I delete the solution, then it will remove any entities that were a part of that managed solution. Now, the only other thing to remember is you can only remove a solution that contains that entity if there's no dependencies on it. So the big thing to remember is if you try to delete an entity and there's other items in the application that are dependent upon that entity, it will not let you remove that until those dependencies are removed, which is a great safeguard because now you can basically make sure that you're preventing yourself from doing something that's going to break the application and not allow people to be able to use Dynamics 365 effectively anymore. So let's go ahead and create a custom entity or two that we're going to use throughout the rest of this course. So I'm going to go into Settings and I'm going to go into Solutions. And I actually already have a solution that we've created here called loan management. But if I open this loan management solution up, I can see that basically we called it loan management. It's version 1.0.0, and it's using a publisher that we created called loan management with a prefix of loan. So if this is something you wanted to kind of recreate, it would be very easy to do. Just create the solution, call it loan management, create a publisher for loan management, and then give the solution the version. But let's go ahead and add a new custom entity to this. So I'm going to go ahead and click on New. And I'm going to just call this Loan Applications, because maybe we're going to go ahead and do kind of loan processing. So I'm going to call this Loan Application. And the plural name is going to be Loan Applications. Now, in this case, you'll see that the schema name has defaulted to a prefix of loan and loan application because that's the publisher that I've used. Once I save this for the first time, I can't change that. So if I wanted to, I could modify it here, but I couldn't modify it once I've changed it. Ownership, I can see here that I can set this as either user or team or organization. Again, depending upon what the situation is, once I set this, I can't change it. We're going to assume that this is going to be user or team owned. So we will leave it at this point. I also could define whether or not I wanted to use an image for this, and if I wanted to use a color scheme for this as well. At this point, we'll just kind of go ahead and leave this information the way that it is. Then I go into areas that display this entity. So this is where do I want it to show up inside the application. Now at this point, obviously loan applications are probably going to be a sales type of situation. And you know what, I might also use them with services as well. So we'll go ahead and define them as sales and service. Because this is a custom entity, I can always come back and change this later if need be. You'll see that options for this entity I have enabled for interactive experience. So this is if I wanted it to show up in Interactive Service Hub. We haven't talked quite a bit about Interactive Service Hub at this point, so I'm not going to do a ton with it at this point, but this is where I certainly could enable this for Interactive Service Hub or the interactive experience if I wanted to. I also have business process flows. This is where if I wanted to have kind of that guided process and I wanted to have these take place in business process flows, this is where I could enable that. I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. We'll just kind of leave it from here. I do want to have the ability to add notes, activities, and maybe even connections to it as part of the application. So I'm going to turn that functionality on. This is also something that I may want to do quick create and other items on down the road, but we're going to encounter most of those later on throughout the course of this customization course. So I'll just leave the rest for now. But if I go over to the primary field and I click on primary field, this is where I can see that display name for the field itself. So the display name is going to be name, the schema name is going to be loan_name. Because it is a primary field, they're going to make it business required. You see that for data type, the only option I have is single line of text. The format is only text, but the maximum length I could modify if need be. Again, most of this information, once I save this, I will not be able to modify other than maybe like the display name, the requirement level, and then actually the maximum length. So I'm going to go ahead and save this entity. And this will actually go through and create this inside of the database. So the other thing to remember is when you create an entity, you are making schema changes. So it does take a little bit of time to be able to kind of facilitate that and bring that into the application. So if this is taking a little longer than you would have suspected, don't worry about that. That's absolutely normal. That's just part of the customization processes because again, it is making an actual database change inside the system. Once this is created, now I can go in and I could truly customize this to fit my specific needs. I could add fields to it if I needed to, but I could also modify additional components or pieces to it. So one of the things that you'll see up here now is once it's been saved is I have this manage properties. So this is that thing we talked about where if I was going to include this as part of a managed solution, how would I want this to be able to be customized? Would I want them to actually be able to go in and make changes to it? If so, what changes? Can they change the display name? Can they add additional properties? Can they create new forms? What types of functionality would I allow them to work with? Now in this case, I probably want them to be able to make changes to that, so I'm not necessarily going to prohibit it, but that is definitely something that you would keep in mind from your application standpoint. I also see over here controls. So over here, this is where we talked about those control capabilities. Well, you'll see here that it says that this is Microsoft Dynamics 365 read-only grid. This is the default out-of-the-box functionality, which basically means when I look at a list, I can look at the list, but I can't necessarily interact with it because I don't have editable grid functionality. If I want to turn editable grid functionality on, this is where I would do this through a control. So I would go into my add control. One of the options that I will see in here is an editable grid. I'll go ahead and click on add editable grid, and then I can configure it. So this is where I can kind of define how I want this grid to be interacted with inside the application. I can have lookups to parent records. I can have nested grid views if I wanted to. We haven't necessarily done a ton with fields and stuff at this point, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because when we get into actual form customization, we will actually do another version of this subgrid, so you'll be able to see that on a little bit larger of a scale. But in this case, I could define that, you know what, I want to use it for the web view, and then I could basically define what specific option I want to be able to look at as we're going through. But for this point, we'll just use it for web. Now, the other thing that you'll see in here is update icons. When you have custom entities that you've created, you can update the icons or have custom icons in here to fit your specific needs. These icons have to actually be uploaded into the system as what are called web resources, and this is what's going to be published out when you're working with it. So as you've added those web resources, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as well, you can define what those images are here, and then this will switch what the images will actually look like inside the application. Now at this point, I'll just go ahead and leave the image files the way that they are. I've got my information for my entity. I can go ahead and save and close this entity, and it will define that information and be stored in the solution so I could work with it as I'm moving forward. Now, the other thing to remember with this is when you create a custom entity as part of a solution, we talked about those entity assets and those subcomponents. The entity that you work with will automatically have everything added. It'll have all the subcomponents and everything brought in because it was a custom entity and it assumes that you want to have that information in there. So you don't have to worry about going in and adding additional items to that like we had for other situations like system entities. The other thing is if I click on Show Dependencies on this option, this will also show me if there's any dependent information. So if there's any entities that this is dependent on, or if there's any items that are required for this to be imported in, this is where you can now see where those situations are. So again, if I wanted to include those as part of my managed solution, this is where I could also do that as well. Now, the other thing I want to show you here just real quick is I'm going to add just one more existing entity to this solution. I'm just going to go ahead and add accounts. And the thing I want to show you with accounts or an existing entity is this concept of customizing it to fit your specific needs. So we mentioned that you could go in and change the display name, or you could go in and change the plural name to fit your specific needs for system entities. You absolutely can do that. But one other thing that you have to remember when you start working with system entities is you also have to go in and you have to change messages, because a lot of these system entities will have different messages that are associated with them. And so if I were to come in and change account from account to consumer or something like that, I can see that there's a messages option down here. I would have to go in for each one of these messages associated with the account entity, and I would have to change the terminology. So for here, I would have to change this to customers. I would have to change a parent account to a parent customer. And then this way, when you publish it out, all of those changes will be reflected across as you're moving forward. It's not something you have to necessarily do a ton with custom entities, but out of the box entities, when you customize them, you do need to go in and make changes. Now again, we'll start talking about fields and all of these other additional components that you see in each one of these entities throughout the rest of the modules, but this is how you can create an entity, get it set up, and kind of ready to go so you can start consuming it. The final piece to this would be that once you have the entity created and kind of published out, then the final piece to this would be that you would have to go into settings and security, open up your security roles. And again, if you haven't done much with security roles, the configuration course for Dynamics 365 does talk on how to set all these information up. Open up the specific security role that you want to work with, and then go over to custom entities and then define what specific permissions you want them to have in these individual entities for this particular item. And this is something that once it's set up, then you can go ahead and work with it from there, but it does need to be set up for each security role that would be accessing that custom entity in the application. So once you have your entities kind of defined as far as how you're going to set those up, obviously the next step to that is now we need to go in and start defining what fields we want to use to store data within the application itself. And that's really what a field is. A field is really just a column in the data in the database that's going to show up on the form in a view, somewhere within that situation. So it stores basically data within the application itself. Now, depending upon what type of field, and we'll show you this a little bit when we get into the demonstration as well, there's different data types and different formatting options that are available based upon the type of field that you're working with. But realistically, once you've said, okay, here's the fields that I want to use, then you'll go ahead and display them on a form, and they'll show up as the actual control on the form. They'll show up in the actual columns or in the list views themselves, whether that's a standard list or whether that's the new editable grid that's available in Dynamics 365. But then because of that, once you've defined them as a field that you want to use in the application, now they're queryable. So now if you're trying to find or locate information in the application, you can use the fields to be able to determine what items you want to work with. But then they'll also get stored in the SQL database. And you may sometimes hear them referred to as attributes by developers, but in essence, they're really just a column that you're going to use to store information as you're moving forward. So depending upon what you actually want to accomplish inside the application, there's a few different field types that you can use inside Dynamics 365 to kind of help you accommodate that. Now, the one you're going to use probably more often than not is basically just a simple field. Simple field is really just going to be data of some kind. So anything that's not going to be based on some type of formula in the application. Typically, when you're talking about single field or simple fields, you're talking about things like text fields, option sets, whole numbers, currency fields, date and time fields, even lookup fields for the most part would be some type of simple field that you would use in the application. Now, oftentimes you may need to also get into scenarios where you want to do some type of calculation. Maybe you're trying to figure out total quantity for a line item. Maybe you're trying to feed information in from another area. That's where you might start using things like calculated fields. And the calculated fields are nice because those are what give you the capabilities to actually do different types of formulas. And we'll talk a little bit more about calculated fields in the next module, and we'll show you some of the specifics around what you can do with them. And then the other type of field that you have is what are called roll-up fields. And roll-up fields are really just kind of an aggregated form of some type of value that you want to bring up on a parent record. So for example, maybe I want to see the total value of all open opportunities for a specific account. In order to do that, I would typically use a roll-up field. That would then go out, would look at all of the fields on that opportunity or all the opportunities associated with that account, look at which one of those statuses are set to open, and then it would roll up all of those individual values. Now, whether or not you have these different types of fields available to you is going to depend basically on the data type that you choose. And we'll talk more about data types here in just a couple of seconds. So from a data type perspective, when you start working through it, there's a few different data type options that you have available on your 365 fields. There's really just kind of a single line of text, which is really just a text field that allows you to go up to 4,000 characters. There's also a multiple line of text, which is basically a single line of text, except for instead of going up to 4,000 characters, now you have the ability to go up to 100,000 characters. Now with each one of those, you can define the actual maximum field length based upon what data and information you're trying to capture inside there. There are also what are called option sets, which are basically your pick lists or your drop-down menus. There's a few different ways that you can store and work with option sets. There's what are called local option sets and there's global option sets. Again, when we get into the next module, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about how to set those up and what some of the specifics are around those. There's yes-no options or two options, which are basically yes-no, true-false type fields, but each one of those can be customized to fit your specific needs and desires from within the application. And then you get into a lot of your more numeric fields, floating point, decimal number, currency. All of those have different formatting options based upon where you might use it within the application. And then you have some options around, date and time fields, lookup fields, and the customer field. And when we get into the actual demonstration here, we'll show you a little bit around what each one of those actually looks like inside the application. When you go in and define a field, there's a few different things that you have to set up to determine how that field's going to be interacted with and worked with as part of the application. So the first thing you have to do is you really have to define how you're going to name it. So there's a display name, much like we saw with entities, there's a display name on the field. Now the display name is important because if you were to go ahead and surface this on a form, this is what's ultimately going to be displayed as the label on the form. Now from a form perspective, and you'll see this when we get into the form editing, you do have the capabilities to go out and kind of tweak that if need be, but ultimately it's going to default to whatever you've defined as the display name. The other area that you're going to see it within the application is also when you start talking about like views. So my active accounts, my open opportunities, the display name is what's going to be shown in there as well. Now you don't necessarily have the capabilities to change the display name inside the view itself. Really the only way you can control how that's going to be displayed in the view is by going in and modifying the display name, which you ultimately have the ability to do at any point in time because the display name can be changed even after the field has been saved. And that's also going to transfer into things like form editor, advanced find, field mappings, workflows. So it's important to make sure that while you do have the ability to change kind of the label on the form, changing the display name is going to ensure that whatever you want it to be called has been surfaced throughout the entire context of the application itself. Now you also have what's called a name field. The name field is the schema name within the application. So once this has been saved, you can't change that information, but this is also if you have any kind of programmatic situations that are going to be involved with that, this is what's going to show up in regards to those items. And then you also have your field requirement, which allows you to define whether or not it's going to be a business required, business recommended, or something like that. This is what's going to be enforced on the forms itself. You do have the ability to modify requirements from a business rule perspective or from a JavaScript perspective. And what I mean by that is making a field required basically means when somebody goes into a form, if that field's required, they cannot save the form until they've actually put information into it. It doesn't necessarily make it required if you were going to import it in from another data source or if you were going to do an integration or anything like that. It only says that once you open that form, if there's no data in it, you can't save it. And so a lot of times what you'll see people do is by using business rules, which we'll talk about, or client-side scripting, they'll kind of toggle that field requirement based upon different variables that might surface as people are entering that information into the form. And then you also have the ability to determine whether or not this is searchable and whether or not this is something that will be displayed in advanced find queries so you can actually search some of the information based upon those items. The other thing that you'll see is some baseline field properties. And so depending upon what options you've chosen, you'll have different scenarios in here. So for example, one of the options you see is for Interactive Service Hub. So if you've gone into the entity and you've enabled it for the interactive experience, now you have the ability to determine whether or not this is something that appears as a filter inside Interactive Service Hub, whether or not it's a sortable field. These are only available if you've defined specifically that you want to use it for Interactive Service Hub. Field security. By default, all fields will have field security not enabled, but at times you may want to enable that. And so one of the things we'll talk about in the next module is specifically how field security works and what happens from that standpoint. Auditing, by default, all fields when they're first created are enabled for auditing. However, you do have to enable auditing at a system level and also at an entity level. In the configuration course, we talk a little bit about how to turn auditing on from an application standpoint, so you can see how that works. So in here, just important to note that simply enabling a field for auditing is not going to turn on auditing for that field unless, of course, you've actually gone in and enabled it at a system and an entity level. And then if you just want to have a little bit more information for, info tips on forms as people are interacting with this, you can actually put some information into the description field, which will then populate that as people are navigating through the application. Let's go ahead and take a look at this inside the application. So I'm going to go back into Dynamics 365, and I'm going to open up this loan management solution that we created a little bit earlier. And I'm just going to go ahead and expand entities, and I'm going to expand the loan application entity. So when I click on fields, you'll see that there's already going to be some fields there. And that's important to note when you create a field inside or create an entity inside Dynamics 365. A lot of fields like created on, modified on, owner, some of those types of different situations are automatically going to be pre-populated for you. So now you can come in and then add additional fields kind of as needed. And so let's go ahead and we'll add a few fields just so you can kind of see how this works. Now the other thing I will note is if you downloaded the course materials inside the PowerPoint, you will actually see each one of the different field types with some different formatting options displayed and different items from there. I'm not necessarily going to spend a ton of time going through each one of those. If you want to look through those, it's a real good reference point, particularly if you're doing some studying and some certification stuff. But what I definitely want to do is at least talk through some of those key elements as we show you this from a demonstration perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a new field. And so in here, I'm going to define, what it is that I want to call this. So first thing is if I'm applying for a loan as part of this organization, I probably have an application date or a date that I'm applying for this loan on. So I'm going to call this loan date or application date. And you'll notice that as I actually go through and tab through, it will automatically populate the schema name for this field based upon the information that I put in there. And it will then default that to basically being an optional field and make it searchable as part of the application. Then if I go in, I can see that there's my option for field security, which we'll talk a little bit more about, auditing, and then down here, these items are slightly grayed out, but this is where if I had enabled the loan application entity for the interactive experience, this is where I would be able to see that in here as well. So down here are my actual data types. So if I come in here and I click on these data types, one of the options that I see is date and time. So I'm going to choose this as date and time. The field type will always be simple. You do have the ability, based upon the data type that you've chosen, to make this a calculated field or a roll-up field or something like that. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and leave it very simply as date and time was simple. Now, because this is a date and time field, I also have some different behavioral options. And I'll just explain this in a little bit more detail for you. From a behavioral perspective, when you start adding dates into Microsoft Dynamics CRM, it stores everything in UTC time, which basically means that if I create a field and I set it as user local and I'm on the East Coast of the United States, when I enter that in, it's going to enter that in as midnight on the East Coast. If somebody else is looking at that field and they're maybe in a different time zone, maybe on the West Coast or the Pacific time zone, it's going to adjust or correct that by 3 hours. And so ultimately what ends up happening is I could see that date as the day before because it's trying to self-adjust. So what this behavior does is say, okay, do you want this to actually show up in the application, as it was entered and then adjusted for the time zone that they're in? Or do you want this to be basically as it was entered? So if I were to choose date only here, which I will, this will automatically say that no matter who's looking at this and what time zone, it's always going to be the date that was selected. So since this is going to only show a date, it's going to show it as date only, and it's always going to be the same date no matter who looks at it. If I choose time zone independent, now it's saying that if I enter a time of December 1st at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I always want it to be December 1st at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, no matter who's looking at it, because this might be an event or something that's scheduled for a specific time zone. So date only means that you're looking at it only in the context of a date field. Date or time zone independent means that you would be looking at it in the context of a date and time associated with it, but you don't want those to adjust based upon the time zone of the user who's looking at it. If I leave it at standard user local, then it will adjust the time zone behavior based upon what time zone I'm in when I'm looking at it. But in this case, I'll just go ahead and choose date only. So now I'm going to go ahead and hit Save and New, and that'll allow me to create another field inside the application. And so now maybe this time I want to figure out, the loan amount and how much they're applying for from a pre-approval perspective. So in this case, I'm going to call this loan amount. Tab down, come down to my data type, and because this is going to be currency, I'm going to select currency. You'll notice that I do have the ability to pick the different precision options based upon this situation. And so for currency, if I just leave it at currency precision, it'll adjust that based upon the currency that we have selected for the record, or I can choose 2, and then it will leave it at 2 decimal places. And then just like any numeric value, I can pick kind of a minimum and a maximum value, and I'll maybe say that the minimum value is going to be 0. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit Save and New again. And so now maybe based upon who, the loan amount or something that we're putting into the application, maybe I need like a manager's approval or something like that. So in this case, I'm going to create a field that basically tells me I need to have a managerial approval. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just call this approval needed. I'll come down to my data type. I will make this a 2 options, which basically says yes or no. And then in here, I can define a default value based upon whether or not I do actually require a manager's approval. So in this case, I'll say, no, I don't. I'll leave that as the default, and then I can kind of continue on from there. We'll go ahead and hit Save and New again. And maybe I want to do maybe a generalized description about this loan or something like that. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and I will just call this description. And I'll come down into here, and for a data type, I'll do multiple lines of text. You'll notice in here I have the ability to make this a maximum length of however I want. The default is 2,000, but I can go up to 100,000. I could also choose single line of text, and if I chose single line of text, you'll also see that I do have some formatting options in here. So depending upon what the value is that I might be trying to look at, in here I might be able to associate it with an email, so somebody clicks on it, it'll send an email to that email address. Maybe it's going to be a URL, a ticker symbol, something to that nature. This is what would do just some generalized formatting to control how it's going to be displayed in the application. From this standpoint, we'll just go ahead and make it multiple lines of text, and we'll hit Save and New. And then maybe we'll do one more in here. Maybe we'll just call this applicant phone. And we'll make this single line of text, and we will format it to phone number. Now, what's important to note here when I format it to phone number is it's not going to put in like the parentheses and the dashes or realize where you are from a demographic standpoint and then format it based upon, kind of the country that you're in. All it's going to do is basically make this a clickable link. So if I'm using like Skype or Skype for Business, I can click on this, and this will then go ahead and dial the phone number, create a phone call activity inside Dynamics 365 for that particular record, so I can log information against it inside the application. Now, the final one I want to show you is around lookup fields and customer fields. And we're going to do a little bit more with lookups and relationships in a future module, but I do want to kind of address one other situation here. So I'm going to go ahead and just do applicant here. And I'm going to come down into here. So when I'm looking at kind of an applicant perspective, I might have different types of applicants that are applying. They might be, an account, they might be a contact. It just kind of depends on if I'm more of a, B2B type of company or more of a business to consumer type company or a B2C company. So if I wanted to, I could choose lookup here and then define what specific entity in the application I wanted to look up. Or I could do customer. And customer is a unique situation because Now I have the ability within this customer scenario to actually associate this to either an account or a contact in the application. Whereas if I choose just a straight lookup, I don't have that level of flexibility. So this just gives me a little bit more options to say, okay, anybody applying for this loan might either be an account or a contact in the application, and I want to make sure that we're associating that as such. So in this case, we'll go ahead and just leave the relationship names the way that they're going to have them defined, and then we can go ahead and save and close. So it's important to note that obviously once you have your entities created, the next logical step behind that is then you need to go in and define what specific fields. And you can create as many or few fields as you need based upon what it is that you're trying to work with inside that application. Going in and creating custom fields and custom entities inside Dynamics 365 is really one of the most basic and common customizations that you're going to make inside the application. By going in and creating them, you now have the ability to really start to tailor the application to your specific needs and meet whatever specific requirements that you might have that are not met through the out-of-the-box functionality. Each item that you're working with has specific properties that you can tailor based upon those individual situations. And so you now have the ability to go in and say, okay, this is what I want to take place. I can create custom entities and I can start to look at those individual requirements. I can go in and define specific entity properties based upon those items. So this is where I can define, is it going to use document management? Is it going to work on individual situations from there? The other thing that's nice is by going in and creating these individual situations, I have the ability to define what specific data I want to capture inside that option. And this is where things like business process flows or document management can really be turned on and off based upon those individual requirements. And this is where now we can really start to make it your own from an application standpoint. Just remember that, once you start creating and customizing these individual situations, you really need to make sure that you're defining what specific data type that you want to work with, because that data type cannot be changed. And that's ultimately what might cause whether or not, specific functionality to work either correctly or incorrectly based upon those things. But if you pay close attention to, what you're initially setting up and working with, it's much, much easier to make sure that the application is going to be able to be tailored and suited to fit whatever your specific needs are.